So I'm going to start this webinar, and I'll start by welcoming everyone who is now joining the webinar, and also just a huge welcome to these wonderful women who have joined us as speakers to hold a conversation that will run from the first nuclear weapon used in Hiroshima right up to the negotiations and achievement of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was, of course, as we know, was chaired by Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, and everything in between, because this has been a long journey. And of course, we're going to be also looking to the future about the next steps to get nuclear disarmament, to actually get that happening. So I couldn't think of a more amazing and brilliant group of women brought together for a webinar than this group that we have here, across the generations, across several different countries and zones of the world. And I just want to thank you for coming, and I want to welcome you. Now, before I go into explaining what weaving the webinars means, and it's just very briefly its connection with Greenham, I'd like to bring in Jane Gregory, who is also a Greenham woman, and she is our tech person, our tech support person, because this is my first ever webinar that I've ever hosted and convened in the world. So I'm on a learning curve. So I'm going to ask if Jane can it's also her first, I have to say, but we've both been trained, we hope. She's going to tell you a little bit about just the housekeeping for attendees and panelists here. Over to you, Jane.
Okay, welcome everybody. Yeah, many of you might have been at a lot of webinars and know what a webinar on the Zoom function is like. But if you haven't, what's going on is you can just see the panelists who are going to be the speakers, and you don't see the participants, the attendees. The chat is open to everybody. So the chat function is on either on the bottom or the side of your screen if you hover your cursor over it, and you can message through the chat function. And then we're going to use the Q&A. I'm sure many of you know about the Q&A, but in case you haven't been spending your lockdown in a lot of webinars, then we'll use the Q&A to ask questions rather than the chat. And Rebecca will make it clear when we're going to begin to take questions from all of you lovely people who've joined the webinar. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And I'd also like to thank Matt, who is the Greenham Women Everywhere technical support person, who's trained Jane and me and is there as a backup in case we really start messing up in any way. But hopefully that won't happen. But we're very grateful to Matt for giving up his Friday evening to be supporting us in this. So what is the connection between Greenham having its 40th anniversary and this webinar? Well, Greenham, as some of you may know, started with a march of women from Cardiff in Wales up to the US Air Force Base at Greenham Common in Newbury, Berkshire, about 60 miles west of London along the M4, for those of you that kind of know the layout of the UK. So not really that far from London. And they took 10 days to do that walk, and they stopped and they talked to people all the way on that walk. And all they were asking for was a half-hour televised debate with the Secretary of State for Defense or the Prime Minister or someone, a half-hour televised debate about the NATO decision to bring cruise missiles, and also Pershing for Germany, but cruise missiles into Greenham as the first base designated for that. And they were ignored, not by the people along the route, but by the government. So when they got there, just like the suffragettes, some of them chained themselves to the main gate of Greenham, and it started raining because it was England. Locals came up, brought blankets, brought some tents, and the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp was born. And I joined it a year later. Yeah, I had actually been going home to the UK from Japan when it started, so I wasn't one of the founders. But I did join actually on Nagasaki Day, 9th of August, 1982, exactly 39 years ago, and had my first action, which did lead to me being arrested, with a group of Welsh women who wanted to commemorate the exact anniversary of the march from Cardiff, the year's anniversary, by actually going into the base and occupying a part of the base. And it was the sentry box we got to, and that's what we occupied. And the reason we did that is because they were threatening, and indeed they did succeed, in evicting us, but we still stayed through many evictions. And in 1987, of course, we were able to celebrate that President Reagan and President Gorbachev signed the treaty, the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that did indeed ban and eliminate from Europe at least those cruise Pershing SS-20 medium-range nuclear weapons. But the job wasn't done, was it? It was unfinished business. And Greenham women stayed to make sure that the cruise missiles, which carried on for a couple more years, being taken out on the roads of England on huge launchers, being protested against not only by women, but by men also, locals who came out on the roads as cruise watch and just disrupted all the nuclear weapons exercises that emanated from Greenham. And meanwhile, we also set up the Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp that was in neighboring the nuclear bomb factories for the UK nuclear weapons, only 6 miles away from Greenham. So we were actually really very busy. Now, as again, just to say that we were entirely successful in not only getting rid of the nuclear weapons out of the silos. Some of you may have seen the pictures of Greenham women dancing on the silos. This sort of action, occupying the air traffic control tower, all kinds of actions. Well, we did get rid of the weapons, and very soon the US Air Force also decided to leave that base that they had occupied since the 1950s completely. And Greenham women and local people worked hard to get most of that area restored as Greenham common land, as it had been before it was turned into a base. And then we kind of dispersed into all those other areas of issues because we had always been weaving these issues together. And so we weren't just about nuclear disarmament. We were weaving in issues of environment, peace and justice, opposing violence against women and girls. The connections of the Pacific were incredibly important for us. And indeed, tomorrow, there is the first Pacific webinar that's hosted by Zolde Ishtar, which has some wonderful speakers from the Pacific. Vanessa Griffin, who's worked for Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific for many, many years and has just joined ICAN steering group. Also, women, just a really great group of women like Chai Lang from the Marianas who came to Greenham at our invitation because Zol had made us recognize that we had to really pay attention to what the UK and France and the US had been doing with their nuclear testing in the Pacific. And then we went on to really pay attention to all the nuclear test sites. And actually, there's a connection here with banning also nuclear testing. And I'm sure Patricia's going to say something about that. So all of these connections are being brought together in what we call weaving the webinars. It's, we used to talk about weaving the web. One of the most iconic images from Greenham was of a poster from one of the major actions where 35,000 women encircled the base. On December 12th, 1982, the exact anniversary of that NATO decision. And the poster for that showed the web that Greenham women kept weaving in and out between, the military, between their gates, closing their gates shut or holding their gates open, or in all sorts of different ways. And the picture was of 2 strands of barbed wire, because Greenham Common was being turned into a fortress of fencing and barbed wire. And entrapped in that Greenham women's web was the cruise missile. And this image, we talked then about weaving the web into the issues like anti-apartheid, where uranium from the British nuclear weapons had mostly come from either Australia initially, or then after the NPT, it was still coming from apartheid South Africa, from the Rio Tinto zinc mines, Rossing mines, Namibia mine, this sort of thing. We made these connections, weaving the web. And ours is an online march of ideas, because 40 years after that Cardiff march, yesterday, a large group of women and a few men and children, because that first march also had a few men and children, it was women-led, left Cardiff to recreate the steps, to recreate the march to Greenham. And they are stopping at most of the same towns and villages, and everywhere they stop, they're doing something, they're talking to the local people, they're having meetings, they're eating together. And everywhere they go, they are talking, they are updating. And most of all, they are talking about the links between the climate emergency and the nuclear, the nuclear threats that still, the 2 existential threats to security and peace for our planet and for the whole of humanity. And these are the connections being drawn. And so I just wanted to give you that background before I now introduce each of our speakers. And the first thing I'm going to do is introduce each of the speakers with a little bit about themselves and a question. And as you can imagine, our very first speaker has to be Setsuko Thurlow, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with her story, but Setsuko was a 13-year-old schoolgirl in Hiroshima on August the 6th, when the first ever atomic bomb was used against a whole city full of people. And she also, and I am so proud and honored that she agreed to be one of the women to accept the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN on December the 10th, Human Rights Day in Oslo, in 2017, after the treaty had been adopted. Setsuko, the first question I want to ask you, and indeed everyone, can you just tell us how and why you became committed to banning and eliminating nuclear weapons? And did you have any contact or connection with Greenham during your time? Over to you.
Well, first of all, I want to say how happy I am to have this reunion. This is wonderful. We saw each other day and night during the conferences, but past 4 years, I have been out of touch with you. This is great. So that was one reason I accepted this happily. And when Rebecca told me this was the 40th anniversary, that was another significant reason I have to grab this opportunity. In any case, I am happy. Now, your question was, why am I committed to the elimination of nuclear weapon? Well, she just introduced me to you. I survived that horrible massacre, atrocity. And with my own eyes, I have witnessed masses of dead bodies. That is something we human beings should never experience. So, firmly convinced that is the right way for me to live. And what else? What other choice? Yes, I have worked as a social worker, but that skill helped me to combine with the nuclear abolition work. Now, my contact with Greenham Common, well, it was this April 1984. I got the invitation to go to Greenham Common. How did this happen? Well, the CND started the annual Easter march, and very successful one. They were bringing about 100,000 people during that whole week. Anyway, around that time, people around the world were hearing and learning about exciting things going in UK and Western Europe. And especially the women at the Greenham Common were doing some courageous thing. So we were all excited, and I was particularly grateful that this honor of visiting Greenham Common came to me because of the Mayor Akiba's recommendation. I learned later on. Anyway, British Council of Churches decided to have a survivor woman to be a participant in the annual visual and pilgrimage. So what I started doing was I got my own Canadian women's group, Canadian Women for the Voice of Women for Peace. I was a member of it. So I consulted with them what to do to show our support for the women in Greenham Common. So we decided to approach Canadian Council of Churches. They gave us wonderful endorsement, the letters of support and so on. We approached the Canadian Labour Congress. They were wonderful. They were behind us. Then we asked the Status of Women organization. This was an umbrella organization for 280 women's organization. So it was a quite large group of Canadians who wanted me to take their message of support and gratitude to Greenham Common. Well, in London, I became the house guest of Peggy Attlee, the family of the Attlee, Prime Minister Attlee, and Peggy's husband was, I think, the UK representative to the United Nations at one time. Anyway, she looked after me in London, and while we were at the Greenham, I stayed with a high school teacher's family in Newbury. I wish I could remember their name and the new contact. But anyway, so the first day was Palm Sunday, and before we started the march, they took me to Greenham Common, and I met a woman who were kind of cold, shivering, with the blankets around them, and it was amazing to relive that moment. Such courageous woman, such resilience to be there and to see the huge mound of silo, you call it, made of the concrete cement. And for me to see it and see that means 1,500 Hiroshima to be stored in that mound, that just started my body trembling, really. That's the kind of impact it had. And so naturally, I shared my surprise, my outrage, and solidarity with women there. Yes, I was in perfect solidarity with them. And then I read here I am reading the messages I brought from Canada, and maybe have a close look. Some in London, some walking from London to Boston, many small towns and villages in about 10 cities, I think, and ended up at Aldermaston, I think. Yeah.
Wow.
This is my favorite. See the little fellow on the back of the mother with. Anyway, thank you. And coming back to London, and I had a number of meetings and conferences, and met the big religious leaders of your capital. Somebody like Cardinal Hume of the Catholic Church, I think, and Archbishop somebody, Mr. Ramsey, Reverend Ramsey, and he invited me to his palace, and we had afternoon tea.
But how did that lead then to, because I can remember we met when we were beginning to kind of try to get the governments going. I can just remember that trip in Dublin with you and Kathleen and Patricia at the meeting back in, what was it, 2013, 2014, to talk about the TPNW. Tell us a little bit about your connection with banning nuclear weapons and getting this wonderful treaty.
Well, it was a great joy to be among the women who were pushing for this, and I've been invited to speak now and then, and met with young, dynamic workers. That was one of the special things about this ICAN group, multi-generational people cooperating together. And that gave me a tremendous hope. And I think we gained a mutual admiration and mutual inspiration to each other. And I think they were determined to carry on the legacy of Hiroshima, and that gave me great hope. And it was great to see the ordinary woman and the man too, working with the diplomats, the government representatives, the ability to be able to work freely, effectively. I think that was tremendous. Now, I don't think I did anything special. I just interacted with members and occasional speech here and there. I'll tell you that actually over many years of working for disarmament, perhaps meeting with ICAN gave me the greatest hope. And I'm grateful for that.
Thank you so much, Setsuko. That just, I mean, it puts things into place, doesn't it? When somebody who was 13 and survived the bombing of Hiroshima is with us here today and recalling all those steps that she has personally taken, that are also steps that we have collectively taken since 1945 to get where we are today, where the TPNW has actually entered into force as of January this year. So my next speaker is someone who's been in my life for a very long time too. Patricia Lewis, Dr. Patricia Lewis, a nuclear physicist, and former co-founder, I think, director of Vertic, the Verification Technology Information Centre in the UK, lots of verification training work. Also, director of the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR in Geneva, for over 10 years, really bringing everybody together to work not only on nuclear issues, but a whole range of disarmament and security and humanitarian issues. Went on to work for the Monterey Institute, currently at Chatham House, but speaking today in a personal capacity about whatever takes her memory. I know you've got a number of memories of that period of time, getting the INF treaty and then the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. It's a fantastic anniversary to commemorate, and I think that it's a great occasion, I think, to reflect on the whole arc of what Greenham women achieved. So I think the first question you were asking, Rebecca, was about why we're so interested in banning nuclear weapons than TPNW, and for me it was partly because of personal history with my family, but also my own profession in nuclear physics originally, that there is, as you know, a long tradition of nuclear physicists working to try to stop the development of nuclear weapons and trying to stop the proliferation and trying to bring about nuclear disarmament. And I guess I'm, in that long tradition. And it started really, and I'm going to link it into Greenham Common before I go into the rest of it. It started really when I went to work in New Zealand at the University of Auckland, where I was teaching physics, and I was the first woman on the faculty. And I helped set up with two of my lovely colleagues, Dr. Peter Wills and Dr. Bob White. Bob unfortunately died a few weeks ago, and I'd like to just put my hand on my heart for his memory. And he then later went on to set up the Peace Institute at the university. He was a remarkable person. And we set this up, and the way we saw Scientists Against Nuclear Arms New Zealand was as a service to the peace movement, not as experts who handed down information, but for us to help people understand things and provide them with data so that they could take that information and campaign. And one of the things that what became a great joy for me is I got into then the women's peace movement, which I hadn't been known about before. I want to show you some photographs. So one of the things we used to do is go out and stop these things. So when they came into Auckland Harbour, and I was in my 20s, I'm allowed to go out and do naughty things when I'm in my 20s, I think. When they came into Auckland Harbour, there's a very narrow channel that submarines can come up, particularly nuclear-powered submarines. And as you know, the US submarines had a don't ask, don't tell policy in terms of nuclear weapons. It's called neither confirm nor deny. I link in the two. So one of the issues was whether or not they were carrying nuclear weapons. It wasn't so much that they were nuclear powered, but whether or not they were carrying nuclear weapons. And they were certainly all nuclear weapons capable. And we used to go out on these little things against those big things. Can you see? And here's one, I think this is of Bob White on one of the boats. I don't know if you, oh yeah, here you can see that. Sorry, I'm not holding it properly. I think that's him in orange at the end there. And these big submarines have to give way to sail. So they had to stop. We could hold them there for days. And of course, the harbour masters, the Navy, the police, etc., did everything they could to stop us from stopping them. So that's how I sort of got into that. And then we had this, I think it was called, and you're going to correct me, Rebecca, but I think it was called the 10 million women for 10 days, was it? So
yes, we were ambitious.
Well, not really, I think, because I think that's actually what happened, because this call went out. And one of the things it said, and that's what excited us most, was that you may not be able to get to Greenham, but come as near as you can. And we had this idea of getting as close to Greenham as we could, which was Auckland Airport. So a few of the team went to Greenham. They went as our sort of emissaries, if you like. I think I've got pictures of them here. I don't remember all of their names, unfortunately, these amazing women. And I'm remembering Skate, Sarah Oy, There's a few of them there. And we all saw them off. And then we thought, well, we'll just stay there and set up camp at the airport. I'm just showing some more pictures of these amazing people. You have to excuse the haircuts. It was the 1980s. And the Auckland airport was extremely accommodating to us. So we were allowed to set up camp in the actual airport for the first couple of days, I think. And then they moved us to this big lift lobby. So everyone who was coming into the airport would go past the stall. There was always people on the stall helping, answering questions, giving out leaflets, all the things you did in the 80s. And they stayed there for the 10 days, gave up their time to do that, and felt very much that they were part of that 10 million core. And I reckon if you added up the number of women around the world who did very similar things, you'd probably get to the 10 million women in 10 days quite quickly. I just wanted to show a wonderful picture of Peter Wills, who's there, speaking from the Keep New Zealand Nuclear Free bus. So yeah, this was quite a time in our lives. And my son was quite young then, and he went on his marches and everything, and he grew up believing he could change the world. And very disappointing when he discovered it wasn't that easy, but it was a great time. So I sort of started working on this issue from then, and as you said, then I went and made it into my career. But I think one of the things that became clear to me was that there was a very poor set of evidence for the ways in which we understand nuclear weapons. We don't really understand whether or not they deter. There's very little data. It's just an assertion that's made. It's a broad brush assertion, and I think it's really difficult to work out what works, what doesn't work, and there are huge risks involved. And during the Cold War, there were massive risks, and we've documented quite a few of them in a report called Too Close for Comfort, the number of times, and we've came very close to having nuclear weapons used after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as time went on, I began to understand that we haven't factored in all of the new post-Cold War risks that we're seeing. We haven't really rethought these things very well at all. And I think we started to understand much more about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and started to frame it that way. Worked to set up these humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons conferences, which then led into the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. And I think that this is, the sort of pinnacle of that way of thinking. Not everybody's got to that particular point yet, but at some point I think they will. So I think that sort of explains it from my perspective, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I'll always remember you coining that name, TBAG, Test Ban Action Group, for the group of us in London, mainly at that point, who were working on the nuclear test, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And you were so responsible for my even going to Geneva to start the acronym project.
Well, we loved a good acronym, didn't we, Rebecca?
We did, or rather we opposed them. Anyway, I next turn to Dimity Hawkins. And Dimity, some of you may know, but not all of you, because although Dimity actually was one of the co-founders of ICAN in Australia, she'd been working on a whole range of other issues beforehand. We met first, I think, when you were working for Reaching Critical Will in its very first year, actually, of getting going, as they began to do the kind of reportage from the UN. And this was 2000, at the time of the NPT review conference in 2000. Thank goodness that Reaching Critical Will took over from me at that point. And, it just, and we've been friends ever since. But, you're one of the women, one of the people, together with Tilman Ruff, and you'll tell us a little bit more about that, I'm sure, who actually founded ICAN in Australia. So I'm going to put the same question to you, which is, how did you become committed to banning and eliminating nuclear weapons? Did you have any kind of connection with Greenham or issues of that sort? Just tell us a little bit about yourself and this connection.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's such an honor to be with this panel of extraordinary women, many of whom, like you say, I've met over 20 years ago or so, before I became earthbound on the other side of the world. I'm sorry I have not yet met you in person, Elaine, but I hope to one day to shake your hand to thank you for everything you did bringing about this treaty. I also, before I begin, I like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nations in Australia, in Naarm in Melbourne. It's the city, as you say, where ICAN was first conceived and launched back in 2007. So I like to pay my respects, first of all, to the elders of this place where I live and work, and recognize that this land was never ceded. And that nuclear colonialism goes on in this country for a long time. Great question to start us all off. I came to be involved in nuclear weapons really because of where I live. I grew up here in Australia as well as in Fiji, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea, all Pacific places where colonialists from America and the UK and France conducted over 315 nuclear tests over 50 years. So as a child, I grew up surrounded by that experience, really, knowing that experience as very, very, very real on the islands, especially in Fiji when I was a child. So my activism started here when I was a young adult around uranium and militarism in the 1990s. Then expanded to more specific work on weapons when I came to work with Reaching Critical Will, as you say, and had the great fortune of meeting you all. And from there, I came back home and started working with the good doctors from MAPW, which is the Australian affiliate of IPPNW. And that's where we launched ICAN from. So it's all kind of this long interwoven web, as these things tend to be. I was laughing, Patricia, with your submarines. I had a very similar experience one time with a nuclear submarine from the US came to visit in our harbors, and yeah, we went out to protest about it, and someone had the great idea that we'd swim out to the submarine in the harbor here, but we only had limited equipment, so I had only one flipper to get there. So I kept on trying to swim through pretty rough waters towards a nuclear submarine, you know, with all these police boats buzzing around us. And I was sort of, at some point, I just went, what am I doing? This is insane. But it was a lovely kind of moment as well, because we were trying to protest about those. Yeah, there's so many other conversations, but I wanted to go to the question that you asked, Rebecca, specifically about Greenham. I never got to Greenham. I was a child in Fiji when Greenham began first, which is, you know, a half a world away, and now 40 years away from us. But it was not to say that Greenham didn't influence me. I had met a lot of women who had been at Greenham or have talked to me about Greenham, of course, you, Rebecca, and I cherish one of our first meetings that we had in New York 21 years ago, where you sang me some of those songs from the Greenham camp, and that was such a joy. Two very dear friends of mine that I was thinking about when I was preparing for tonight were friends who were at Greenham. The first of those was a Gulgitha woman from the desert country here in South Australia, who I came to know very well over the years after she visited Greenham in 1988, I think it was. Her name was Joan Wingfield, and Joan has left us now. Those of you who met her back then, though, would remember her fire and her passion, and how fearless she was in holding account the nuclear industry. I was later to work alongside her, and I knew her mother and her sister, who were really strong, outspoken advocates for nuclear justice too. And we all worked together with an amazing Indigenous-led group here called ANFA, the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance. Sadly now, though, all of those three incredible women have passed away, but I carry with them their stories in my heart and in my work. Joan's mother was Eileen Wingfield, and she was one of the women elders who established a group called the Kupapiti Kungajuda. They were fighting for the right to say no to a nuclear waste dump here in Australia in the 1990s, and they won that fight. There's so many stories of Indigenous women here in Australia who win these fights. They're probably not known well over in the UK or in other parts of the world, but there's just the most remarkable resistance movement here in Australia. Mrs. Wingfield, though, was also a survivor of the British nuclear testing, and the pain of that experience was never far from her, or so many of the other Kungas who led that remarkable movement as well. Anyway, dear Joan joined you at Greenham in 1988, and I know that Zolda Ishtar captured some of her beautiful words in her book, Daughter of the Pacific, which I actually have here. I don't have lots of photos to show you, but I can show you this wonderful book, which, as you can see, I use a lot in my studies. When Joan and I met maybe 5 years later to work together, we were organising a protest against another US base here in Australia, this time in the South Australian desert at Narungga in 1993, which is on Gulgitha lands. And she spoke to me sometimes of what she saw at Greenham as well. So the other friend I had here who went to Greenham and who was a Greenham woman was Gisela Gardner, who was born in Germany but protested there in the UK with many of the Greenham sisters. And then she came here to Australia, which is a great thing for us. Gizi played a big part in establishing ICAN, in fact. When we first had the very beginnings of the idea of ICAN, it was Gizi who travelled to Europe with her partner, Dr. Bill Williams, who went to meet with NGOs and activists and parliamentarians and other leaders to ask what they thought of the ideas that we had and what they thought needed to be done to change the global discourse on nuclear disarmament. So those conversations, they led to a lot of really deep thinking on our behalves when we were first establishing the campaign. But they were also the mark of what I think of as the epitome of a feminist approach to establishing this campaign. When they came back, you know, we had so many conversations and wove those into all the other international conversations that we were having with friends around the world. So Gizi, like so many other Greenham women and like so many feminist women I know and have walked alongside in this work for over 30 years, really knows how to speak truth to power. So that's my experience of Greenham. It's kind of a surrogate experience, but it weaves well beyond the shores of the UK and it shows the reach of Greenham. I think Greenham women like, you know, Wilf women from, you know, from the First World War onwards, or the many extraordinary women I've seen leading the way here in Australia or throughout the Pacific against nuclear testing, or those women who are working in the UN, holding nuclear states to account, like yourself, Elaine, and many, many others, you know, or those people who walk in the halls of power or on the streets. You know, I see Greenham then and now as part of a continuum. So I guess that's my short answer, but it's really, as I said at the beginning, you know, it's just such a joy to be here with you all, and I'm thrilled to sort of have this conversation with you all.
Thank you so much, Dimity. Now I turn to Kathleen Sullivan, who has been a researcher, and I'm sure you're going to tell us a little bit about that because you did quite a lot of this in the UK. But also, particularly importantly, a disarmament educator, took the stories out to kids at school, to more than 45,000 young people in New York schools. Not only heard from Kathleen, but Kathleen founded Hibakusha Stories and took Hibakusha from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the schools to tell the children, to tell the young people, the students, what nuclear weapons actually mean in real terms, in human terms. And well, so I know that you spent your 40th birthday at the Faslane nuclear base during the Faslane 365 activities.
With you, Rebecca.
In 2007,
yeah.
And I was invited, thank you. But were you ever at Greenham, and what does feminist disarmament mean to you? And I ask you the same question also about how you became committed to banning and eliminating nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm so honored to be here with all of these beautiful women who are my dear friends and mentors. And, it's interesting to think of WILP, which I would like to touch on, and also education. I was in high school when Ronald Reagan was president, and I really did not think I would live to adulthood. I was terrified as a child in the United States. And what happened, I became an activist. My mother took me on my first anti-nuclear action in June of 1982. It was a sister action to the million people that rallied in New York City, where Setsuko was, on June 12th, 1982. And when I got to college, nuclear weapons had remained a concern, but my great aunt, Anne Swift, who lived with Jane Addams at Hull House, had retired to Boulder, Colorado, and she took me out to Rocky Flats, and she pointed at a nondescript, industrial building and said, "This is where they make the plutonium triggers for all US nuclear weapons." And I had never understood what plutonium was. I knew that, nuclear bombs were bad and they could destroy everything. But to hear the word plutonium, that truly changed my life. And that's when I really got involved in all of this. So we have the WILP connection. That was 1985. In 1989, the FBI raided Rocky Flats and it was shut down. And that was a result of citizen action. And that was very exciting involvement with nonviolence and the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. In 1991, I moved to the UK, where I embarked upon my doctoral dissertation. And I wrote about the social, ecological, and temporal effects of nuclear weapons and nuclear power, using Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a containing metaphor, with plutonium as the monster. So that was kind of exciting and sort of literary and activist bent. Greenham was going on then. I did not get to Greenham Common, unfortunately, but it remained a lodestone in my life. I met Rebecca, who was a big mover at Greenham. Also, my dear friend Oak Shazar. So I've had personal connections. But the most profound for me was my dear friend and mentor, Joanna Macy, who went to Greenham Common in 1984. And Joanna had what she called a deja vu of the future. She sort of looked across the wood smoke, having a cup of tea in the rain, and saw encampments like this around nuclear facilities all over the world. The reason why, the temporal investigation of nuclear technology is so important is because we all know that this stuff lasts for generations, tens of thousands of generations. How do we imagine that? How do we think about that and responsible care for the materials? So Joanna sort of looked through and saw these women, intrepid, absolutely dedicated, who were taking turns to stop the madness. And so likewise, into the future, who will be the ones that will guard the radioactive materials? Who will tell the next generation the stories that we have to hear? How will we translate those stories in languages of the future? So instead of the industry's, still to this day approach, which is we're going to take the waste and bury it and hope that nobody finds it or knows about it, which is the absolute opposite of what we have to do. We have to train ourselves in storytelling. And this is where I come to the beautiful work with the Hibakusha. Setsuko and I have worked very closely together for 20 years to bring their stories to young people, for people to hear the actual firsthand witness is just extraordinary. And I have seen Setsuko interact with students in New York. We go in there, we think that we're teaching young people about nuclear disarmament, when actually we're teaching them about shared humanity. And Setsuko, I know you'll recall one afternoon in Manhattan when there was this young man who was standing back after your presentation, and he wanted to speak with you privately. And he just burst into tears. And he and Setsuko had some private moments together. And then we left, and you shared with us the story of what he shared, which is that his mother had been murdered. And he felt that he would have this feeling that nobody would ever be able to feel such a horrific thing had happened to them. And after listening to Setsuko's testimony, a kind of dam broke in his heart, and he understood that suffering exists for other people, and that when we reach across to share our stories, that's where healing can begin. So, the stories have been profound about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the care and the compassion, and this is the feminist disarmament piece of how we do the work in the world. And I just briefly want to say that I was in Reaching Critical Will, Dimity, 2000. Setsuko was there too for our Truth Commission. And that's where I met Patricia that year, Rebecca a little earlier. But the WILP office, just to come back to Annis for a minute, the Reaching Critical Will women, Dimity, Felicity Ruby, primarily, really started envisioning ICAN right there and then in 2000. So I think that, not only did ICAN have its initial beginnings in Australia with the doctors, but also across the world, Greenham women everywhere with WILP. I see that very clearly. Again, it's a beautiful honor to be with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And now we're going to bring things right up to date, because our next panelist, our next speaker, Ambassador Elaine White-Gomez, of course, anyone who has been at all involved in the TPNW negotiations knows how brilliantly, how carefully, how effectively Ambassador White-Gomez, Elaine, our sister, but also the best person to be able to preside over and chair the negotiations, the UN negotiations on multilaterally banning and eliminating nuclear weapons, and bringing the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to life. And so I'd like to turn to you now and say, so how did you get into this area? But I'd also like to add one more question to yours, because it's also, and why do you think it is so important to have the full and active involvement of women at all levels, all aspects of disarmament, diplomacy, and peace building? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you to all of you for sharing your experiences. I only regret not having been able to meet you all many, many years before. Let me just start by sharing a little bit of my history, because many of you we did not get to meet each other until the moment of the negotiations. And while I was listening to your experiences in the 80s, and I want to tell you what I was doing in the 80s, because in my part of the world, being in Central America in the 80s, I was getting involved in politics, party politics in Costa Rica. I was part of the youth movement of the Christian Democrats in Costa Rica. But apart from that, this was an era, remember, of civil war in Central America and dictatorship, military dictatorship. And not only in Central America, but in the whole of Latin America. So in the 80s, I was going through this, I'm the generation that saw the fall of some dictators in the region, the wars and the search for peace and the search for regional peace agreements, especially the ones in which my own country and my own leaders were engaged in. It was the regional plan, the areas plan for the peaceful negotiations for Central America. So I am that generation that saw my region being inflamed in civil war, going through peace, negotiations, confronting, which actually was part of what happened with my government, that my government confronted the vision and the policy of the great powers in the region. And one of the pillars of that peace process was precisely telling the superpowers to get out and to stop the military assistance and military buildup in the region, saying, you put the weapons, we put the bodies. We don't want that anymore. We want a peaceful settlement for this process. And the one very important part of the regional peace agreements was the demilitarization of the Central American societies, which meant the decrease in the role of the militaries, but also to put them under civilian control. So that was our generation's great struggle to see this democracy and demilitarization. But then you can imagine where my demilitarization mindset comes from as well. But I did feel the issue of nuclear policy being so far away from our reality. And also because during the university years, when I was studying, nuclear deterrence and strategy, everything, great power politics and strategic issues, my professors, I think, convey this message that we, like in small nations, we didn't have that much of an impact. We didn't have that much of an impact. So I grew up believing that we were disenfranchised from that discussion. And actually in the 90s, something that I did do when I came back from the US studying my master's, the first thing I did, I worked for the Costa Rican legislature. And there we were able to pass legislation against sexual harassment in the workplace and academia. This in the Costa Rica 25 years ago, 20-something years ago, before the Me Too movement. So you don't know that what I learned going through that process was what I put into practice when I was chairing the negotiation, managing this difficult process of negotiating a legal text. So that I learned. So this is why it is so important that everything that we do in life helps us or builds up. You don't know when you are going to need those skills. So I get to, from well, not surprisingly, my main focus had been regional integration for development and peace in mostly Central America. So that was my main focus of academic work. And I worked on that. I still work on that a bit, more than 20 years. So when I went from the regional to the global level back in 2014, that's when I went to work at the UN. my first, say, encounter of the first type with the disarmament field was in the open-ended working group of 2016 that worked from Geneva. And remember this feeling of being disenfranchised and thinking that nothing really was happening in the field after, you know, the reduction of the nuclear arsenals by the two superpowers, right after the second, I mean, at the end of the Cold War. I was absolutely revived and enthusiastic. You know why? Because I saw my colleagues, of course, from all over the world, but I saw my colleagues from Latin America playing such a huge role in the discussion and in telling the superpowers, the nuclear powers, what we really thought about. And the women in my region, women ambassadors and experts at the technical level, were so passionate, so knowledgeable, and also so hopeful that the feeling of being disenfranchised completely changed for this feeling of how to move the agency, our agency, in this regard. So that completely changed my perception and my own experience. So when I had the responsibility of chairing the negotiations, the first thing I thought was I was conscious about the long journey traveled by the Ibakusha and traveled by civil society and by many governments. And of course, I felt somewhat a lot of like a heavy weight on my shoulders, because I understood that long journey had to go through the process, institutional, procedural aspects, institutional aspects of a negotiation. And of course, I was scared. I was having such responsibility, but I do recall in working with my colleagues at the Costa Rican team, in saying that process was very important in the negotiation. So we paid a lot of attention in the process and in the inclusion and working with regional groups and trying to bring everybody on board and trying to lift everybody up. And I was very aware of the special needs of small states delegations, because small states, we have, you know, our diplomats have to deal with everything. We don't have dedicated staff to specialize on nuclear disarmament. So I was trying to see how we could have some technical or conversations with experts in the lead up to the negotiations. That was not possible because the negotiations were in New York. It was not very easy to disturb the New York agenda. So, but I did hold that concern, to put it that way. And when the opportunity came, that was we knew that in the first session the agenda and the discussion was moving forward, and we are going to have some moments that we could use for other things. And that's when I realized it was the opportunity to have some sort of expert panels to engage with the delegations and to be able to completely reframe and refresh and give new thought and specific inputs for the delegations. And I feel very proud of that, and how that methodological innovation, it really paved the way for to create a very good environment. Two other aspects that I think are fundamental also on my personal level as well, is that in this process, part of what was necessary to convey and to demonstrate is that this process was about the people, not about the states, right? So that was the reason why it was so important to have the Bakusha with us in the room, to let us on a permanent level to tell us it was about the people, and it is about the people. And I cannot express how my humanity was touched when I heard when I heard Setsuko, and my voice was breaking when I tried to regroup myself after I heard her in the room. And the other aspect that I want to share with you also is, now that we have been analyzing what's going on in Afghanistan, I have insisted, very, very much insisted on something that I strongly believe, which is you need to be in touch with the realities on the ground to be able to make assessments. You don't make your assessments so far away from your desk and trying to understand such a complex reality. Well, bringing that to my own experience, of course, as a Costa Rican diplomat, I had even in the process, I didn't tell you, in my regional process, I had been engaged in training militaries in the region about the new concepts of security, human security and democratic security. So you can imagine that I did have very much in my DNA this new approach to security. But in being a Costa Rican diplomat, of course, I was completely committed to the issue of nuclear disarmament, to obtaining and achieving the legal prohibition of nuclear weapons. But after the March session, I was able to go to Nagasaki because the ICRC was holding the World Conference there in Nagasaki with the national chapters of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. So it was the first time, although I had been in Japan, it was the first time that I was able to visit Nagasaki. Later on in the year, I went to Hiroshima. And that was my experience in bringing myself to the ground, and also in having this experience, being part of who I am and of who I was. And that completely changed my energy. It completely changed my, how can you say, the level of commitment that I developed after. I mean, it was not something that I was doing on a personal level, on a professional level. It was something that I just got into my humanity again. And it just completely changed, as I said, just the level of conviction that I had towards the negotiations. Something that I looking towards the future, that if I think that now that the issue of last year, the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Resolution 1325, just put so much saliency to the issue of the participation of women in all disarmament, security, and peace negotiations. Now it has gained so much saliency, which was not actually what happened when I got to Geneva in 2014. I think that a dimension of this Women, Peace and Security agenda is to promote further participation of women in these negotiations, in leadership positions as well. But I have been thinking that we miss something. And I think what we miss is this ethical compass, this leadership compass that I see that you are all providing. I came across not only with the experience of Greenham women leadership, also I have in this process of rediscovering the role of women, also have been reading and analyzing the work of Alva Myrdal, the first woman who got the Nobel Peace Award for her work on promoting disarmament and nuclear weapon prison treaties. And I understand that one of the most important aspects is how we build a good bridge, a communication, a link between generations, so that new generations of leaders and diplomats actually can benefit from precisely from the work and the legacy of these women and women leaderships who have built these milestones that we need to feel encouraged, to feel inspired, and to feel empowered by those experiences. It would have been very helpful for me, and I think it would be very helpful for the other generations to be able to highlight all these milestones and the role that women have played in this process. I want to thank you very much for making me part of this group, of this generation. I very much cherish your experiences. I admire you very, very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elaine. And it's been a real honor for us also to have you join this webinar, and to join a webinar where we're actually learning from you all that backstory in your life that you brought into your diplomacy that was so successful in bringing the treaty into fruition. And, you know, when you talked about Setsuko's, that speech that Setsuko made when the treaty was being adopted, it was so powerful. And you speaking about it, as it just reminded me of that, the shivers and the wonder that I felt sitting just across the aisle from her as she spoke. And just to also let you know that on the Greenham Women Everywhere website, in fact, there is that wonderful animation that Kathleen helped and Amber made possible, of turning that speech by Setsuko in her words and in her voice into an animated story of what she said. It's really powerful, and you can connect to it. All of you in the audience can also connect to it. And you made me remember, Elaine, that lineup of eminent women, other eminent diplomats from Costa Rica who were part of your team, all dressed in white. And on one side of you also the Japanese Ambassador Izumi Nakamitsu, who was the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. And I think there was probably one man, I think it was probably Tom Markram, also on the platform, and also a good friend. And this is really, and you also mentioned 1325, and I think it is just so important also then in recalling this, because Dimity mentioned what an important role that Flick Ruby played in making, in starting Reaching Critical Will, and, you know, with the ideas, you know, to get ICAN, to make ICAN, but she was absolutely crucial in 2000 at the UN, working with the other women in Oxfam and Amnesty International and a few others in making 1325 happen. People, you know, this needs to be also connected up and recognized. So now we are just in our last 15 or so minutes. And I'm really wanting to focus you now on next steps. And Elaine began to talk a little bit about that. And I'd like you to think about, and also if you've got questions for each other, we've got about 15 minutes. I'm not actually seeing, and I gather that the audience is just loving the storytelling that's happening here, but maybe there will be some questions if they come up. But think about the next steps. What's next for disarmament, for nuclear disarmament? What's next for the TPNW? Now it's entered into force. We know there's going to be the first meeting of states parties happening in Vienna. It's now going to be in March of next year, 2022. We've also got the Non-Proliferation Treaty happening, again postponed because of COVID, happening in New York, COVID willing. 4 weeks of negotiations of the review conference on that treaty. What's next for disarmament? What's next for nuclear disarmament? How can we get our governments? I mean, here we are, we've got the UK and US represented here, who are nuclear armed states. We have Australia and Japan here, who are part of nuclear armed alliances. We've got the Irish here also, who one of the early heavy lifters, have signed and ratified. They're going to be there as states parties in Vienna. Of course, Costa Rica. What are the next steps? Again, I turn to my panel now. Setsuko, please do.
Yes. I want to pick up some of the words Elaine introduced. She talked about inspire and empower the following generation. And I want to say a few things about that, because since the even adoption at the UN, and then ratification of the treaty and so forth, a series of unthinkable gain has been made. And this has made a tremendous impact on Japanese mentality, I think, and especially young people. It's not only the government or official institutions such as boards of education or city governments, but the private enterprise and newspaper companies and magazine companies, or even fashion designers groups and so on. Those groups, organizations are getting interested in informing, educating people about this treaty. And this is tremendously encouraging. We have waited over 7 decades. And finally, the Japanese are feeling, well, our time has come. People are finally listening to us. I think humanitarian initiative idea, the philosophy, really galvanized the attention of the world. I think that's why a lot of young people joined and worked with us. So how do we get the young people not only to learn about what has been done, what we have now, but how are we going to make it work for humanity? I think we have a lot of challenge to respond to. And since I have been hearing from Japan, I want to share this feeling of excitement. Maybe I should speak more in the concrete terms. Well, I'm getting a lot of requests from magazine companies, newspapers, or ordinary publishers who keep saying, well, it's great. We have this treaty. We want everybody to learn what the treaty is saying, how it's going to help humanity. We want to publish the books to help people. So some companies want to produce the newspapers and magazines for elementary school children. And they want to use my speech at the Oslo or other people's speeches from the past, and to introduce the content of the speech to the elementary school children, junior high school children, and senior high school children. And it's amazing on the national scale, this is happening. They are taking initiative, not leaving it to the government. And since opportunity exists, we have to just grab this opportunity and do everything we can to ensure the increased knowledge and understanding of the citizens, so that they can be more effective in getting their government to change their minds. Like here in Canada, I live, and in Japan, they still turn their heads away, and they said that they don't want to ratify the treaty. But if we get people better knowledgeable and more informed and committed, maybe we have better chance, better hope for the future. To me and to many people, to get our own government to support the great treaty United Nations adopted 4 years ago. So that's what I would like to see the focus. And the latest public poll I got from Japan was that 90% of university and college students understand what this treaty is about, and or at least they have heard about. Only 10% of the young people knew nothing about this treaty. I think this is a tremendous result. So with some evidence of increasing interest and commitment among the younger generation in Japan, I have reason to be excited. I just wanted to share this with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Setsuko. Any other one of you want to speak about next steps? Dimity. And then Kathleen, I'm seeing.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Setsuko, for that reminder too of the importance of passing this on to our next generations, of which you speak so beautifully all the time. And that is one of the key aims with going forward, I think, is to really sort of bring those next generations along. You know, Rebecca, you said, you know, have we got questions for the panel? Oh, so many. I have so many questions. I want to ask each of you. I want this conversation to keep going on for hours because I have so many ways and conversations that I would like to talk about with each of you. But I guess, you know, time being limited as it is, I wanted to just sort of reflect on a few things if I could. I've got so many notes written here. I've been scrawling notes all the time. One of the things I found so interesting in what you were saying, Elaine, was around the small states and the ways in which small states can so often in the UN processes be quite marginalized and quite belittled and so forth. It's certainly something that's experienced here a lot in the Pacific as well. But the Pacific, there's a shift in language and thinking to not be so much small island states, but large ocean states. And so there's all of that, but there's sort of like an internalized smallness that happens sometimes. And it happens with women as well, that sometimes we are so put upon by the patriarchy, by the ways in which we are told that we don't matter, that our voices won't make a difference and all of those sorts of things, that we start internalizing that smallness. And it's things like this, it's the gathering of women together that actually changes that and shifts that, and the prioritizing of women's voices and women's perspectives, but not just ours. It's also an intersectionality where we start looking much more. And I guess this is something that I was thinking about in terms of forward looking, is now that we have our beautiful treaty, and it is a beautiful treaty, it's a beautiful thing, how are we going to make that, how are we going to operationalize that? And some of that will come clear through the meetings of the first states parties, first meeting of the states parties, but we will also be seeing more parties join, more states join this as well. But we'll also see an evolution going on now with our civil society input into that. So some of the questions I have about that, and they're mostly questions at the moment still around, you know, how do we reconcile nuclear colonialism and nuclear racism and how they play their part in the continuation of nuclear travesties? And how do we seek different perspectives through the eyes of our LGBTIQ families, plus families, you know, or through language and cultural barriers? There are a lot of different ways of seeing these issues, you know, depending on where you are in the world. It was something that you also said, I think, where, you know, that we must always, not everyone can be on the ground at these UN meetings. I certainly have not been able to be in the last 7 years. So I've worked very solidly from Australia on these things due to health issues. So I haven't been able to be on the ground. But one of the things that you can't always be on the ground, but we can always seek out and deeply listen to those who are. And we should continue to do that. We should really seek to do that, to really build our understandings of our role in nuclear justice, but particularly when we come from countries that are either colonized or have colonized, those that are nuclear armed or those that seek shelter from other nuclear armed countries as well. We must also be seeking remedy for the nuclear harms to our First Nations people here, for example, in Australia, but also throughout the Pacific. For nuclear veterans, for the families of those loved ones who had bones taken from them in autopsies to test for strontium-90 in Australia over 20 plus years, for example. There's so many horror stories to be told. How do we support the rising tide of voices across the Pacific who are calling for the world to join this new treaty and to seek the justice for the victims and the survivors of colonial violence? So those are just some of my questions. And again, they are more questions than anything else. I'm really mindful of time, but I think one of the other questions I had, and it's a general one, but maybe it's to all of the panelists, but also all the women joining us tonight, is what keeps you hopeful? What keeps building that hope? Because when we started ICAN, hope was very much a very central part of what we were doing. It was not about just looking at these weapons and banging our heads against those brick walls that they put up. They weren't even doors, they were just brick walls that they put up about being accessible. We were very mindful of the horror of these weapons, but we were also very mindful of looking beyond. So right from the outset, it was a vision beyond nuclear weapons. And I guess that is fed by hope, and a real hope. And now that we have the teeth of that hope in this treaty, I really look forward to hearing how people build on that hope. Last one thing, if I may.
We still have to bring in Kathleen and Patricia.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, it's been wonderful what you've said, but I just want to make sure that everyone gets a chance just to come back and make a few last remarks, and then I have to publicize the next couple of webinars at the very end. But Kathleen and then Patricia, and time is running out, but I believe that we can spill just a few minutes over before we actually close. Kathleen.
Thank you, Dimity. Thank you all. It's been such an honor and privilege to hear you all. I think that going from the global scale to bring it down locally, what we're doing in New York City is really interesting. There's a group of us that are affiliated with ICAN. We call ourselves NICAN, and we have some very powerful legislation before City Council. And the legislation is, joining the ICAN Cities Appeal, showing some, support, endorsement for the TPNW, of course, but also, they didn't call it the Manhattan Project for nothing. Most of the uranium that was used in the Manhattan Project, which came from Canada and also Belgian Congo, refined in Canada, which Setsuko has written a brilliant brief on that she gave to Prime Minister Trudeau, which he has yet to respond to. That's another story, but we can provide for the people who have participated here today Setsuko's letter to Trudeau, which recounts the deep and intense collaboration of the Canadians to the Manhattan Project. But in New York City, not only this is interesting, the first successful fission experiments happened at Columbia University on January 22nd, 1939. Who would have thought that 81 years or whatever later, we would have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entering into force? As a beautiful tribute to that, My beloved colleague, Robert Kronquist, who's my collaborator in Hibakusha Stories, organized with the Illuminator a massive multi-story illumination of Setsuko's words on the side of the Secretariat building: nuclear weapons, always immoral, now illegal, with also snippets of Amber's animation of Setsuko speaking at the UN when the treaty was adopted. So beautiful local actions. But to the legislation, there is, and this is where we can look to the positive obligations of the treaty, there are still sites in New York City that need remediation. Even in, for example, Chelsea, which is a very upmarket kind of neighborhood of Manhattan, there was uranium that was stored in a warehouse that now houses the offices for the public park, the High Line, that had uranium in drums that was so physically hot that it had melted into the concrete. That wasn't remediated until the late 80s. There are other places, for example, Ridgewood, Queens, in the outer boroughs, where unfortunately a group of people who were terribly bored and pent up during the pandemic organized an illegal rave for about 400 people who, saw the danger, do not enter, but they didn't know that where they were entering was a legacy site of the Manhattan Project. So our legislation recognizes that these sites are mainly in marginalized communities, and that this may need further remediation, calling us to the positive obligations of the treaty on environmental remediation and assisting people who have been exposed. And lastly, another very radical part of the legislation is to have New York City pension funds divested of nuclear weapon producers. There is a minute, I think it's like 0.25% of the massive New York City pension fund. That's the fund for city workers, the New York Police Department, the fire department, et cetera, teachers, that is invested in nuclear weapons. It's roughly around $500 million. The city has already agreed to divest from fossil fuels. So we're basically saying this is a very easy task for you as a way of practicing rules. And I'm very happy to say that we have a new comptroller coming in who has really dedicated himself to divesting our pension funds from nuclear weapon producers.
Thanks, Kath.
So it's wonderful to think also what we can do locally with the treaty, even in nuclear armed states.
Those are very, very important practical points to remind us of. And ICAN, of course, really has the city's appeal and the parliamentary networks that are now working on, and also to bring parliamentarians to the first meeting of states parties and so on. I turn now to Patricia, and also would like to just bring Setsuko and Elaine in for just some last, a couple of minutes each of your last sort of thoughts before we do have to close. Even though I have to say the audience is saying, keep spilling over, but I know, we can't spill over forever. But Patricia, and then let me ask Elaine after that, and then Setsuko, we're going to give you the last word before we do the closing.
Thanks, Rebecca. I just wanted to really say how much I've agreed with everybody and everything that they've said and how important it is. And I wanted to address the issue of hope and the issue of humility. So I think that we have to hope, because hope is not the same thing as optimism. Hope is a belief that there are other ways. There are better futures. And if we don't hope, we have nothing. And every single act that we do every day is about our hope for the future. And then that comes, I think, with humility. What we need to be doing, and I think it was Alice who asked about, how we can link what's been going on in Afghanistan. And I can take that back to 9/11 itself. I can take it back to the war in Iraq in 2003. But, people in charge, people who are making decisions, don't understand a lot. It's clear, there's lots of big things that we don't understand. They're unable to predict what might happen next, even though there are people who can tell them. there's so much uncertainty in what might happen. And I think that's what we need to inject and just keep asking questions. You know, how do you know that nuclear weapons will deter? How do we know what will happen in the event of misinterpretation of information? You know, how do we know that our intelligence about all of this is correct? Just keep on asking those questions. Don't believe all the, you know, mad conspiracy theorists. But ask really good questions that you have yourself, and keep everybody humble so that we all can admit, every one of us, including those who want to get rid of nuclear weapons, as well as those who want to, you know, get more of them, we can all admit that there's a huge amount that we cannot know. It's really important. And so that's where I would go with my hope, to keep open the future in that spirit of understanding that we cannot know everything.
Thanks, Patricia. And now, Elaine, would you have just a few closing remarks for us?
Yes, thank you very much, Rebecca. I would like to follow up on Patricia's remarks, and she just made me remember the press conference that I had to deliver at the very end. I think it was at the very end of the first session, and a journalist asked me some of those questions of disbelief, and he asked something about hope, and he said, what hope do you have? And I said, everything we do in life is an exercise of hope. Everything we do in life is an exercise of hope. Even waking up, getting up in the morning. So in the same line as Patricia was reflecting upon, of course, we are very concerned about this repositioning of the nuclear response to the great power competition. And I think this might be a time in which we need to reframe, re-strategize, and reconceptualize, and spend some time in doing that, because we already have the treaty, and the treaty is a product of reframing, re-strategizing, and reconceptualizing. And while the treaty is going to continue on the path, and I really hope that we are going to see very soon the 100 states parties, I think we need to do that. What do we do now with this new state of affairs in order to reframe the problem, to re-strategize and reconceptualize? And thank you all for your inspiration. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us too. And Setsuko, what are you feeling now? Share with us your last remarks for this webinar.
Well, my heart is full. I don't know which one to talk about. Once again, I picked up a word from somebody, maybe, was it Elaine? No, Patricia. You use the word humility. With humility, we open our heart and ears and eyes. We learn as much as we can. Yes, I think we have to continue to do that. But for years and years, for decades, we feel we have been lied at. We have been exploited or manipulated, starting immediately in the aftermath of the bombing. We kept hearing from the people who brought that disaster, well, radiation is nothing to worry about, it's not bad. That's the kind of direction we have been given, and people soon realize that's all lies and misinformation, disinformation. We rejected many of the things, and we just kept on speaking out what we saw as a truth. But this truth we thought we had been just scoffed at for years and years. Only the high priest of nuclearism have the answer. I am not explaining very well, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. So you can imagine how relieved, how liberated I feel when I started hearing the ideas of humanitarian initiative to bring human being to the front and center of consideration, not the other complex and technological scientific things, deterrence or balance of power and all these things. Only the people who have the mystery, who understand the mystery of such technology can solve the nuclear age problem. Well, so it's been a tremendous experience for me personally and for many survivors. Yes, it's people issue, which we have to consider as a central issue when we talk about nuclear weapons. So, but we realize that not all the nations accept this, and nuclear armed states continue, I think, for some time, insisting they have the superior knowledge.
Thank you so much, Setsuko-san.
Yeah.
You speak from the heart.
Yeah.
And you're right. And of course, you leave us on the note that reminds us, of course, that we have to bring the 9 nuclear armed states and all of those other, the NATO states, and the ones in the nuclear armed alliances, and those who endorse and in other kinds of ways sort of condone or collude with nuclear weapons. We have to bring them. There is now this multilateral treaty. It's in the UN. It has entered into force. We have to make it work in each locally and nationally and diplomatically and politically and personally and across the board. It's there. We can use it. We must use it, and we must make it happen. And really, I just want to thank all of you. I think this has probably been one of the most fascinating and both heart-wrenching and inspiring conversations. A webinar, who knew that a webinar could be a conversation like this among just some of the most inspiring and brilliant practitioners of nuclear disarmament, from the activist to the diplomatic, from the personal to the political, and everything across those boundaries. They're not boundaries, are they? They are weaving the web of all of those things together. So I want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you so much to all of you who have joined us, listened in. This is recorded and it is going to go up on the Greenham Women Everywhere website. We're not sure when, because they're incredibly busy with so many events happening with the march. And then there's a whole weekend of activities happening at Greenham Common and Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp over the weekend of September 3rd to the 5th, which is the anniversary of that march actually founding the Greenham Women's Peace Camp. And we've still got a couple of webinars that I need to tell you about. The very next one is actually happening tomorrow, or if you're Dimity in Australia, it's happening a bit later today. It's happening at 6 p.m. Sydney time, 9 a.m. UK time. It's hosted by Zol Deishtar, who was also at Greenham for a long time and brought together the testimonies from Pacific women of that book that Dimity held up. And in her webinar, she is going to be welcoming, and we're all going to be listening to ICAN campaigner, but nuclear free and independent Pacific campaigner before she was ICAN steering group, Vanessa Griffin from Fiji, and FemLink and Pang, Chai-Lang Palacios of the Northern Marianas, who I remember when she came to Greenham in the 1980s and spoke to us about the impact of nuclear testing and all those other nuclear and colonial activities in the Pacific. Lisa Natividad from Guahan, from what Americans we know as Guam, Guahan. She's a Chamorro peace activist and also part, in fact, I met her at the Women Cross DMZ, which is crossing the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. I met Lisa in 2018 doing that. And Corazon Valdez Fabros from the Philippines, from Pacific Concerns Resource Center and former IPB co-president. You do have time to be able to register for this. Zolda Ishtar has been sending out links. There's also the link via the Pacific event, where the Pacific event is on the Greenham Women Everywhere website. You've got time still to register for that, and the Zoom webinar link will be sent out to you within about 30 minutes before that Zoom is due to start. So if you're in Europe or the UK, please get up in time to be able to join us for that, because these are amazing speakers that Zol has brought together. And the link for that also, thank you, Jane, is there. And then there's another one before the Greenham weekend, and then there's going to be a lot more afterwards and going right to the end of the year. But let me just talk about the next one very, very briefly, because it's on feminist peace and looking at the links from Greenham to Women in Black, the anti-war work that feminists have so long done against violence, militarism and war. It's taking place on the 31st, on Tuesday, 31st of this month, next week, in other words, and it'll take place again at the same time, 7 p.m. UK time, and whatever time that is in your zones. And it'll be another kind of conversation among a number of women who are involved in different ways with those connections. Again, the link can be found on the website of Greenham Women Everywhere under Feminist Peace for that. So finally, it just remains to say thank you from my heart, from my head, from my soul and from my spirit, to all of you for all the work that you have done, all the work that you are doing, and all the work that you will be doing for disarmament and peace and security and justice in this world. Thank you for joining us. Thank you also to Jane and to the Greenham Women Everywhere tech support. Hiding behind that name is Matt, who have been holding my back for this first webinar. We did it together. Thank you all, and good night or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you. The webinar is now being closed.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.